All right, and we are live with Shauna Lawless. Thank you very much for
Hello.
being here. I appreciate you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
So, would you like to introduce yourself, a little bit about you and who you are before we begin?
Okay, well, my name is Shauna Lawless, and I live in a town called Castlewellan in Northern Ireland. It's like a small town, and I've got 3 children. And writing and reading have always been hobbies that I've absolutely loved. But once I hit 30, writing kind of ramped up, and I got very into writing. And I wrote 2 novels. So The Children of Gods and Fighting Men was my second novel, but it's the one that got picked up by an agent and then by a publisher as well. So it's sort of my debut novel.
Right. So I'm kind of curious. You live in it says in County Down in Northern Ireland with your husband, your 3 boys, and your lovable Sprudel Chewy. We got to check on Chewy first. Is Chewy okay?
Chewy's good. Chewy's
Okay,
fine. Yes. Yep. She's sleeping at the minute, so she's all good.
And one of the things that I want to do is, just in case nobody gets further than this in the interview, I would love for you to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the book briefly. And so if someone had never run across your work before, what is the thing that you would say to them to give them a reason to pick it up? What would be the thing that would stand out as, oh, you need to check this out because?
Okay, so it's a historical fantasy set in 10th century Ireland. So if you don't know Irish history, I think you'd find it really interesting. And also, if you don't know anything about Irish mythology, I think you would also find it interesting. I think a lot of people know Irish folklore, but Irish mythology is older than that. So I think it's sort of new to a lot of people, and hopefully a kind of good, also exciting historical fiction and fantasy story.
Combined together into one, because it's a little bit of fantasy and a little bit of history.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular genre for that? Are we supposed to call it one thing? Because I get mixed up in my genres.
I think historical fantasy has sort of become its own genre, especially recently. We had She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. There's also kind of a lot of mythological retellings that have historical elements as well. So I think historical fantasy is starting to become its own thing. And for me, historical fantasy is a story that is very grounded in historical reality. So you have the correct setting, a certain period of time. You don't necessarily have to have historical figures, although I think most historical fantasies do.
Okay.
But then within that historical setting, you need to have a fantastical element. And so whether that's kind of derived from the mythologies of the country you're talking about or something completely different, it needs to combine the both.
So let's talk a little bit about you as a kid. Okay. Were you a bookworm kid? Were you a scraped knees kind of kid? Were you knocking over banks, getting drunk at 2 a.m.? What were you like before you were 13 or so?
All right. Okay. So I think I was I grew up with 5 nephews who were my age. So
grew up like same house or like right across the street?
On a couple of streets away.
Streets down. Okay.
Yeah. But my sister would have looked after me a lot because my mum would have been working. So with my nephews, it was very rough and tumble. It was, climbing trees, riding bikes, kind of off exploring. But then when I was on my own at home, I was a bookworm. So I read a lot. I didn't watch a lot of TV. Mm-hmm. We only had about 3 TV channels when I was growing up, and kids' cartoons were on maybe for an hour in the morning and then an hour in the evening, and then that was it.
That's all you got.
Yeah. So TV wasn't huge for me until I was older. So reading was definitely my hobby. I love reading, and I read hundreds of books.
So you can kind of play both sides of the fence here. You're like, you can go out during the day and play rough and tumble and do biking and roll down a hill, and then come back at night and perfectly be satisfied reading a book.
Yes, but I also think, when I was doing a lot of that rough and tumble playing, like we used our imaginations a lot, and we would kind of create like role plays, and we would create characters for ourselves, and there would be bad guys coming to get us and we would have to run away from them. It was a lot of imagination play, and then I kind of all linked in some sort of way, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Those stories from childhood become the things you start writing down.
Yes.
So when you were a kid, and I'm talking, pre-13, did you want to become a writer? Did you want to become an astrophysicist? Like, what was the thing that you were pursuing? Were you going to be a pop star diva? What did that look like?
No, probably when I was that age, I wanted to be a vet. I was very into animals, and like a lot of the stories I read were about animals as well.
All creatures great and small kind of vet?
Yeah, I loved that series, and I loved Animals of Farthing Wood, which was like a really good book series by Colin Dan. So I think that was what I was into when I was 12, 13. And then I got a bit older and realized that a lot of being a vet is putting animals down. And then it didn't appeal to me just so much. I think I'd romanticized that career too much.
Right. Not everything is the story of Tricky Woo and his cute little picadillos.
Yeah. So it didn't appeal to me quite so much. I wrote a lot when I was younger, but being an author didn't really click to me at that age as being a career. It didn't seem something that I could do.
Well, and you wrote your first story when you were 7? Is that right? 7, 9?
Yeah. I would have been writing my own stories at that age. Yeah.
So what were you writing then when you were a kid? Were they kind of like little 3-page act 1, 2, 3? What did it look like?
Oh, well, I had like lots of notebooks. So it would have been like with my pencil, like handwritten stories. So some of them would have been short stories, but I did have one story which was sort of a novel, but I don't know where these notebooks are anymore. So I don't know really how long it was, but it felt like a novel. But it was really fan fiction of the Animals of Farthing Wood. So it was about foxes that were trying to escape fox hunts and like live in the forest and escape from the people.
Oh, I love that. And this is the novel that you kind of lost when you were about 19?
No. So when I was
another missing novel?
Oh, yeah, there's loads. I know. So yeah, the novel that was actually a novel I wrote when I was 18, 19, and it was about fairies and giant lizards and who were enemies. And so I think that would have been like a middle grade type novel.
Okay.
But I've lost it. I don't know where it is.
Oh my God. Okay, what can we do to help? Do we need to do like a search of County Down, or what do you need to do?
Do you know what? We have these old laptops in the Rift space, and I think we need to bring them to someone who can like help salvage like anything that's on them, because it must
story about YA lizard people.
Yeah. No, I really loved writing that book. It was very good. It was the lizards lived in the mountains, and the fairies lived in the forest, and then people lived everywhere else. And the fairies held this kind of power, so that the lizards couldn't cross over from the mountains. But then the people found this power that maybe some of them wanted the lizards to come off the mountain.
So was this set in Ireland? Or was it set in fantastical wherever land?
Completely fantastical.
Oh, yeah. I love it. Well, so let's talk about Ireland for a little bit. You were one of the very first people that I ever talked to on Discord. And you were talking about the legends of Finn McCool, right? And I didn't even know who Finn McCool was, but there's no better name in the entire world than Finn McCool.
Yeah.
So with you and Ireland and stories, this is all part of your passion. How did that come to be?
Well, I suppose, my granny, first of all, wrote a lot of stories. So I had her stories when I was younger and I read them, and they would have been about the fairy people and based on Irish folklore. And of course, we had Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and, loved movies like that. But as I got older, and then I was living in Ireland at that time, because we moved over when I was 9, Irish mythology and Irish folklore is everywhere. It's in murals on the wall. It's in stories. Like we would have access to all these legends at primary school, in songs that that would be sung, and just even just part of the culture. Like everyone knows who Finn McCool is and Cuchulainn, and like places are named after them, and you can go on tours to see various places in Ireland that are related to them. So it's just sort of everywhere. So I feel like growing up in Ireland and living here for 30 plus years now, it's sort of very ingrained in kind of the things I'm interested in, and I've had a huge amount of opportunity to be interested in it, I suppose. But then, of course, then you realise that people not from Ireland don't know this stuff. It's very new to them.
Yeah, the Cuchulainn, which I can't even pronounce. Can you help me?
It's Cuchulainn.
Cuchulainn?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
close enough.
Yep. Yep.
And again, I had to look it up. It was like, oh, what does this look like? And I want to talk about your grandmother for a little bit, because this was no mythological storytelling to her.
No,
right?
she
had a
believed
deep
in the fairy
attachment to
people.
these legends and mythos. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So my granny, she grew up in the country in Ireland, although she lived most of her adult life in Belfast. But she really believed in the fairy people. And the fairy people are descended from the Tuatha De Danann. In our legends, the Tuatha De Danann eventually were defeated by the sons of Miled, the Milesians, and they were banished underground. So the fairy people sort of became what people began to think of as what the Tuatha De Danann used to be, if I kind of get that out right. So by the time my granny was alive, the 18th, 19th centuries, the fairy people weren't always good. Sometimes they played tricks on you. You wouldn't want them to pay you much attention because they could get up to mischief.
Right.
So my granny loved stories about the little people, but she was also afraid of them. So my dad told me a story recently where my granny took them on holiday to a cottage in a different county. I think it was County Louth. And the next day she packed the bags before the holiday was meant to be over, and they all had to go home. And whenever he asked her about why that was, she said that during the nighttime she heard the fairy people outside the house, and that was like a bad omen, and they had to leave, that would have been bad luck for them to stay.
Oh my gosh.
So she really, really believed in them. And also people like older generation now and the generation before, things like you wouldn't have cut down a fairy tree, which would be a hawthorn tree. That would be bad luck. And there's a lot of superstitions around the fairy people and not angering them. So so for my granny, yes, it was like a huge thing, and she did believe in them.
Well, and that's part of where the tradition of knocking on wood comes from, right? The idea that you knock on wood to kind of release the good fairies if it's something that you're hoping for, right?
Do you know, I don't know about that one, but there's loads of superstitions are to do with that sort of thing. It's to kind of give some wood is like yew trees and things would be perceived as having good luck. And then there's other wood, like say hawthorn, that's just to do with the fairy people that you wouldn't want to knock, or you wouldn't want to be in a fairy circle in case you angered them. So
right.
It's all the superstitions are like to do with things like that.
Well, one of the things that I want to talk about again with your family is, would you be willing to talk about your 30th birthday party and what kind of effect that had on your life?
Yeah, so a big one, really. So the story I told you about that was lost. A few people read it, so it did have an impact on some people who were able to read it. And somebody who really loved that story was my husband's uncle. He loved it. Like he thought it was really, really good. And every so often he would be, are you gonna get me another story or something else to read? And I was now in my 20s, and I was working full time and got married and had kids. And writing was still a hobby, but the amount of time I was able to dedicate to it had just drastically diminished to virtually nothing, really, just here and there. So by the time it got to my 30th birthday party, there was a party in my house, and my husband's uncle, his name's Q, he was talking to me, and he's like, so where's the next novel? And I gave my tried and tested line of, "No, I'm too busy and don't, 3 kids and don't have any time to write." And he just went, "Well, that's just nonsense. Because if you really like something, you would just find the time." And my instant reaction was to be annoyed, because I was like, "Well, what do you mean? I don't have time. I'm working. I've got kids. You can't conjure these extra hours out of thin air." But over the next couple of days, those words just played in my mind. And I think because myself, I was unhappy that I wasn't finding time to write. So it had been something that had annoyed me for quite some time. So I spoke to my husband about it. And then he says, "Well, look, it's time for the kids to go to bed. I'll do the bedtime routine tonight. You have an hour, just write and just see what comes out in the hour. And we'll take turns. We'll do every other night. So 3-4 times a week, you're going to have an hour to write." And I suppose up until this point, the thought of writing in little bursts hadn't appealed to me, because when I had written my first novel, I'd been a student and I'd had 4, 5, 6 hours, whole days, where I could just write to my heart's content. And so it was a sort of a shift in mentality where I had to go, right, that's not possible. That will never be possible until I'm like 60 or 70 and retired.
Right.
So you need to use this like an hour every other night. Can that work for you? Can you make that be your new routine? And so I did. So that night I wrote, and I didn't stop. That we kept that routine going for years and years.
And you were able to assemble the Children of Gods and Fighting Men with that exercise. Is that correct?
Well, I had a novel before the
Right.
Children of Gods and Fighting Men. So the first novel I wrote was about 230,000 words.
That's what I have written here.
Yeah. It was just, well, I think I didn't have any real ambition to be published still. It was just for fun, and It was just to make me happy. And if a novel came out of it, then that would be brilliant. But it wasn't the objective. So I got to 230,000 words. And then that took about 2 years to get to that. And then I thought, right, well, we need to knock this into a bit of shape. And then I went on to Critique Circle, and I spent about 2.5 years on that, learning to edit and learning how to make a story out of this jumble of words that I'd put together. So after that, then I started on the Children of Gods and Fighting Men.
Does the first one feel almost like a test novel for publication, where you feel like you've got an opportunity to hone your skills in an open and free environment, and then when you started attacking Children of Gods and Fighting Men, it was with the intention to publish?
Yes, I would say mostly. I think with the first book, it was learning to write again, because I hadn't really written for maybe 8-9 years.
Right. And
it was writing a story I wanted to write, and then learning to edit and make it readable. So I learnt a lot. And then, so when I started then on the Children of Gods and Fighting Men, before I started that, I didn't just launch straight into that as I had with book one.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of had a few thoughts, like, what do I want to do? What sort of word counts are we aiming for? Not that I think you need to have a prescribed word count all the time, but 230,000 words is too long for a debut novelist, really.
It's a bit much.
There are exceptions, but few and far between.
Sure.
And just a bit more thought into keeping the storyline a bit more simple than the first book. And then I started, and I think the 2.5 years learning to edit really, really helped, because I think I went into book 2 knowing how not to make the mistakes I made in book 1, if that makes sense. So, you don't need reams and reams of exposition. You don't need to info dump. Dialogue doesn't have to be a paragraph long. It can be a sentence long. Your characters need to be built up from the get-go. You can't do that chapter 5 and chapter 6. Just all those things that I'd done wrong the first time round.
So there's an old adage that says writing is editing. Do you ascribe to that? Does it feel like editing has to be part of what you do?
Well, I don't know how it is for other people. For me, my first draft is just like a splurge of storyline. Yeah, and it's mostly dialogue and kind of who's where and what's happening. Then my second draft is making it nice, you know, and it's kind of adding in a lot more texture to the story. And then after that pass, then it's editing for me. So that's how I go about it.
In editing, do you find yourself trimming down the first half of what you wrote more, which is the dialogue, or do you find yourself trimming down the prettiness, or is it kind of both evenly?
I find my faults as a writer are lengthy dialogue, so I have to trim that down.
Okay.
But then under not giving enough, like where are they, what does it look like, just like a bit of description, and I need to add that in. And so then I cut words in the dialogue, and then I add words when I'm trying to build the scene, make the scene a bit more tangible.
Yeah.
Because I'm from Ireland and I'm writing it, I see it so clearly, and I have to remind myself that people do not know what Ireland looks like, and I need to add that in. And then probably my very last pass is reading it aloud, and that's where I want the nice prose to be refined. You know, it needs to be nice to read aloud.
And do you go through the entire work aloud?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is mind-blowing. Have you ever considered doing your own audiobook?
Well, no. I don't think
No.
I don't think I could do an audiobook. I think I find it hard acting like the male characters.
Sure.
I don't know. Anyway, I think I would find it difficult to do. But no, I'm very lucky. I've got a very good audiobook narrator called Aoife McMahon.
Mm-hmm.
And she does Sally Rooney's books and Cecilia Hearn and Marion Keyes. So she's like a professional actress who does lots of audiobooks. And I'm like, no, she knows what she's doing. She'll do a great job. I don't think I would have done a very good job.
Well, it's a good thing that you've got plenty of strong female central characters. Yes. One of the things that was important to you is it almost feels like your mission statement is to explore the history and mythology of Ireland in a more authentic way. Yes. And you have two main female characters, and I want to talk about Glorm Faith. Can you help me pronounce it correctly?
Gormla.
And thank you very much for providing a glossary, by the way.
Yes.
But she was a historical character. This is a real person.
Yeah, she's a real person.
When you originally started, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you originally started writing her, you kind of wanted to do a little bit of a turn on it and make her a softer, maybe more sympathetic character. Yes. And then as you were writing her, you kind of came to this realization, right?
Yeah. So she's the historians that have commented on her do not like Gormla. She is the kind of wicked stepmother to one of the people who spoke about her. And then to another one, she is like overly ambitious, mean-tempered, and provokes people into going to war.
Right.
So I think a lot of books I had been reading recently or just before I had started to write this, the female characters from history were getting more sympathetic retellings. So books like The Other Boleyn Girl, which is a retelling of Mary Boleyn, but instead of portraying Anne Boleyn as this kind of scheming woman that kind of broke up a marriage, you actually get, well, no, Mary and Anne Boleyn were daughters and their parents wanted them to catch their eye of a king. And so you get a much more sympathetic portrayal. You know, they didn't actually have a lot of power. And then there's other retellings that we have now, like say Joan of Arc and Medusa and Circe. And so whenever I was thinking of Gormla, I was thinking of doing that and saying, well, she was horribly spoken about by these historians. Why don't I tell her story? And she's a more sympathetic character, someone that we can get behind. But whenever I started to do my historical research and kind of get the male characters at the time and the wars that were going on, I just thought, if Gormla is not really, really hard, she is just going to be destroyed by these people and she will have no voice. You know, so for her to be a realistic woman at the time, I was like, no, she needs to be very strong. She needs to be as devious as these male characters are. And she needs to be able to play her part. Otherwise, she just won't work. Otherwise, it's just going to be a kind of damsel in distress story, which I didn't want to write.
No.
So so then I started to write chapter 1, which didn't really change very much. The first Gormla chapter, where someone is dead and she is having a conversation with her mother, and that all just kind of flowed out, and her voice was quite sharp and clever. And then I was like, no, I knew then, no, I need to make her like this. I need to make her probably worse than the historians have said, but give her more agency and kind of make her like a very interesting character to read about, whether or not you agree with the things she does. But to make her have a lot of agency and to be interesting was my goal.
And then as a counterpoint, Gormla is the more, if Gormla's ambitious, Fodla is kind of the ground eye view of what's going on in the 10th century, right?
Yeah. Yes. And so that for me was very important because sometimes I think historical fiction focuses too much on royal families.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not getting really the view of the people as to, you know, what's happening. So for Fodla, I wanted her to be a complete counterpoint to Gormla, in that the same things quite often are happening to the both of them, but they react to it in completely different ways because they're completely different people. And so Fodla very much wants peace in Ireland, but not just for herself and not for her family. I think she realizes that it needs to be peace for everybody. You know, you can't pick peace for yourself and then have everyone else miserable. Society only works if everybody has equal opportunities and equal safety. So that is her viewpoint. And in the story, she is given guardianship of her nephew, and it's about her trying to navigate Ireland at that time and find a way for them to be safe and happy.
So I wanted to ask you, given kind of your mission statement, there are two authors that I'm kind of curious about your relationship with. Okay. The first is David Gemmell and the Regante series.
Yes.
What about that kind of rang true with you?
Yes, so I really liked the Regante. Of the character of the Morrigan is from Irish mythology. She's one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And so even though I initially read the Regante and thought it was Irish based, but other people have argued with me and said they thought it was more Scottish.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But the Morrigan is definitely an Irish goddess of the Tuatha Dé Danann.
I know that
So
one.
there's, you know, whether he's decided to kind of use both cultures in his book, that probably is what's happened. Yeah, so I really like the way he combines the Irish mythology. There's another thing that he used, which was people were told when they were born about if they did something, it would cause their death. So the opening chapters of the Regante is with a man, and he's told, I think it's to do with if he kills a bird or if his horse kills a bird, then he will die. And he's about to go to battle, and that thing happens before he goes to war. And that is also something that happens in Irish mythology, where characters have these, they know if there's a sign that will happen,
right,
that will lead to their death. So Cuchulainn is told that if he eats dog meat, that will lead to his death. And then in a famous story called the Cattle Raid of Cooley, he's tricked into eating it by the Morrigan, actually.
Oh, wow.
She's in that story. So I find David Gemmell's use of Irish mythology really entertaining, and he sort of set it in a historical type land, which felt a bit like the Roman invasion of England was about to happen. So I really enjoyed that story. It was a bit like historical fantasy, but except it was a made up historical place, but that was based in real history, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, and not that it matters for any point in this conversation, but Ireland kind of stands alone in the idea that it's one of the few places that was not overrun by the Romans.
Yes. And I think that's why culturally it's so different to the rest of Europe. It didn't have that real time of occupation. And also with that occupation, Christianity moved along it.
Right.
And while Christianity did come to Ireland, it didn't come quite so forcefully.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another interesting difference as well.
Well, the other book that I want to ask you about is Star of the Sea by Joseph O'Connor.
Yes.
What is it about that book that got its hooks into you?
Do you know, the Irish famine obviously is a very tragic part of Irish history. And it's almost something that's very unreadable because it's just so tragic. You know, there's nothing good that happens in that period of history. There's one book that we read in school, which was called Under the Hawthorn Tree, which is quite a famous story in Ireland. And it is the only famine book I'd ever read up until this point. And so when I picked it up, and I was like, how has somebody managed to create a story about the famine that is engaging and not really just soul crushing?
Right.
Yeah. So I picked it up and it was just so good. It's about a famine ship that's coming from Ireland to America. Mm-hmm. But on board you have a landlord that's fleeing Ireland. You have a murderer. You have a newspaper reporter. And you have a maid who is connected to the murderer. And so it's almost like you have a setup of an Agatha Christie style novel.
Absolutely.
Because there's a bit of like a kind of thriller crime storyline going on. And I think somehow that manages to disguise the tragedy in a way that you can read about it without it being all consuming, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And it's very well written. Joseph O'Connor is an excellent writer. So that also kind of really elevated the story as well for me.
So one of the things that I also wanted to ask you about was kind of your publishing journey, I think, should be an inspiration to people in the story of how Shauna got her first book over the finish line. This was not easy. This was not a simple A to B point voyage. You went through, rounds of difficulties. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So I turned 30. I've written my first book. The 230,000 words got reduced to 180,000 words. So I had a go at submitting that, and it got rejected. And I got an agent called John Gerald to read that book. And not wanting him to be my agent at that point, but just I wanted someone to read it and just to be, why didn't this work?
Right.
I think sometimes writers, when they have a manuscript that isn't working, they send it off hoping that somebody will make it better or good enough to publish.
Right.
But that wasn't me at this point. This was me saying, I know this isn't getting published. Why? Don't make me feel better. Don't tell me what could be fixed. I want
give me the straight truth, Doc.
Yeah, that was exactly my thought process. So he got back to me, and that story was set half in 11th century Ireland and half in the future. Mm-hmm. So he read it and was like, the future stuff was, it was okay. It was fine. The 11th century Ireland stuff was really good. And every time you took me away from that, I was annoyed. And every time I came back, I was really happy.
Okay.
So he was like, my advice to you would be like, write that book, write the Irish history story because I did have the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians, that kind of storyline was in there. So he was like, you need to just find a way to write that story because that's different. And I can tell you've done all this research and you know all this mythology, and not anyone could just do that. So funnily enough, I had already thought about the children of gods and fighting men. And so it really just galvanized me and made me think, right, okay, so I was already thinking of this story. He's basically told me that that's the story you should go with. And so that gave me a lot of confidence to write the story. So I finished the story over lockdown.
Right.
So then I thought, right, I'll have a go at submitting. And I didn't get a huge lot of feedback in my first round of submissions.
Right.
A couple of, maybe one full manuscript request. I sent off a few more manuscripts, and I included a few small presses that time. Mm-hmm. So that go, I had offers from a couple of the smaller presses to publish, and I was gonna sign with one of them. It got quite far into our talks, and then they ended up having issues on their end. So I pulled out of that.
Yep.
And I just thought,
good choice, by the way. Well done. That's a hard thing to say no to, and I'm so glad you did.
It really is hard when you have an offer there, but I think when it's your book, you need to be confident that whoever is going to sell your book can do it and knows what they're doing. And if they're having difficulties their end, then that's just, it's not that they can't do it, but timing isn't great, right? Right. So, and there was nothing wrong with the press. It's not like it wasn't like a fraudulent press or something like that. It was just for probably because of COVID and for various reasons, they were just having distribution issues.
Experiencing technical difficulties.
Yes. Yes. So I thought no. So then after saying no, I thought, right, well, maybe you've had interest. People have enjoyed reading it. So maybe I should self-publish and just see what happens. And I booked an editor who was a very, very good editor. Lots of people use this person, and they had a 4-month waiting list. So I was like, right, okay, booked them, and then thought, well, I have to wait 4 months anyway. Why didn't I just give this one more agent submission go? And because of lockdown and COVID, lots of my favorite agents had been closed. And when I was looking now, they had reopened again because the vaccines were out and books were back in the bookstores, and their backlogs were lifting a little bit. Right. So I just thought, well, these are the agents on my list. I'll submit to them and just see what happens. And so it was just odd, and it's timing or luck. But on that submission pass, I had 4 full manuscript requests. And I'd also submitted to Head of Zeus directly because they were having an open window, and they asked for the full manuscript. And so I ended up with offers from 3 agents and from Head of Zeus as well, which was just crazy.
After the course of, 2 years, I think?
So from I started to submit the first time, it was probably, it would have been less than a year. I started submitting about June, July time. And then this last submission pass was in April.
Still, I honestly feel like that's a story that new novelists need to hear, in the thinking that getting it over the finish line is just, I'll send it out and somebody will pick it up and off we go. And here you are going out with multiple rounds. You've got one that picks you up. You decide that's not the right thing. You keep moving. There's a lot that goes into it. I just think it's an inspirational place to come from for new authors and people that are getting out there with their initial work.
Well, I think it's just definitely, I'd say to anyone out there with a manuscript, finding the right agents is key, because see the agents who were in my 3rd pass, most of them were my favorite agents, but because of lockdown, they had all been closed.
Right.
And I think, I had done my research. I knew what agents were looking for what, and these were the agents that I really felt would like my book. And so, it goes to show research definitely works.
Yeah.
And, I think I'd done a couple of passes before then, and really that's not a lot. You probably need to you could send out to 50 agents, 80 agents really before that's kind of a no. You know, I think sometimes people give up too soon, maybe.
Sure. Absolutely. I do want to talk about that cover a little bit.
Oh, yes.
I mean, right from Jump Street, you launched September 1st?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and that cover was out in the wild in like March, right?
Yes.
Or was it before that?
Yeah, maybe February, March time. Yeah.
So did you have a hand in putting that together? Was it one of those things that they put together for you and said, here you go? Was your initial reaction positive? Did you know that it was going to have this type of positive reaction when you first saw it? Just tell me about your experience with the cover.
Okay. Well, okay. So having someone design my cover for me was huge. And it was something actually that really scared me about self-publishing, because I'm not very good at art,
right,
and I'm not very good at directing people as to what I even would have liked. So when Head of Zeus designed the book, they had a wonderful designer called Michaela Alcano design it. And as soon as I saw it, I was, oh my God, I love that. Like I couldn't have even pictured in my head something as amazing as this.
Good.
So I was delighted. I was so delighted and happy that this was my book cover. And my agent after we had the call with the publisher was like, "Are you really happy about it?" Because he's used to authors not sometimes being happy.
Sure, I can only imagine.
Yeah, and I was like, "No, this is unreal. I love the cover." So whenever it was finalized, and then they start to thumbnail it onto Goodreads and onto Amazon. I think I spoke to Head of Zeus about doing a cover reveal. And because at that stage I'd been blogging for about a year, maybe more. And I'd been blogging before I had an agent anyway, and before I had the book deal. So I just really kind of spoke to some friends I'd been kind of talking to on Twitter and Discord who were also bloggers, and just asked, would you want to do the cover reveal? We're going to do a day, and hopefully if I can get maybe 6, 7, 8 people interested, we can have kind of blog posts throughout the day. So that was brilliant. I think that worked really well, generating that first round of interest. I think as a debut author, you are contending against a lot. You've got the big authors, you've got fantasy TV shows, you've got like indie authors who are really doing so well and really working social media, and so you have to rock it too. You need to put your book out there and not be afraid to show it off. And I actually find showing the book cover off quite easy, because I didn't design it, so you're kind of praising somebody else rather than yourself.
And it looked great, so that helps.
Yeah. So that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the cover reveal. And then I think, that the cover is beautiful. So it kind of caught a lot of people's eye.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the Words of Kings and Prophets.
Yes.
Do you mind if I ask where you are? How that's going? What's your process like? Are you enjoying working on the second book, or does it feel like the deadline is always creeping up on you? What's that like?
Oh, it's done. It's handed in. I'm working on book 3 as we speak. So book 2, because I had that 10 months period where I was submitting, and things not quite working out. By the time I signed my book deal, book 2 was halfway finished. So, and you write yourself. I think once you're at that halfway point, the story is set up, and all you're doing is kind of unweaving the action. So I think it was good because it took the pressure off, because I was already at that point where the story, everything was set into motion, and so now I was merely unraveling the story and then events unfold, I suppose. So the sense of pressure I didn't feel quite so much. I'm feeling it a little bit with book 3,
right?
Because I want to, you want the story to continue, and for the the very pivotal scenes, which I've had in my head for years to actually work.
And does book 3 bring it to a close?
Well, I have a 3-book deal, so that's what I signed up for.
Okay.
In my head, it's a 6-book series.
Okay.
So there is an ending, but it's not the ending.
More to come.
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I cannot tell you thank you enough for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it. I don't even know if I've got my watch with me, so I'm going to try and do 2 minutes with Shauna Lawless on the fly. Does that work for you?
Yep, let's do it.
I'm going to time that out. Sure. I'm going to see if I can put together a stopwatch out of the equipment that I've got on me. We'll see how that works. All right, let's go ahead and do 2 minutes with Shauna Lawless. All right, here we go. What was your least favorite food as a child, and do you hate it now?
My least favorite food was Brussels sprouts, and yes.
And yes, those are excellent answers because Brussels sprouts are terrible. What is the worst job you ever had?
I worked in an ice cream stall, and the ice cream was so hard that my whole arm would be like absolutely bruised from scooping.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah.
Do you have any one old person thing that you do?
Oh, I love sturdy cardigans. So I think my dress sense is old person style.
Nothing wrong with the cardigan. That's where they've got it right. If who would be the perfect reader for the Children of Gods and Fighting Men?
Anyone that is just interested in reading a bit of Irish history and mythology.
Fantastic. What is your guilty pleasure?
There's no such thing as a guilty pleasure.
Oh, I like that answer. It's very good. What's the craziest dare you ever took?
Oh, I'm so not a dare person. I was always truth. No, I can't even think of one.
What's your silliest memory with your best friend?
Oh gosh. I'm so bad at being put on the spot with things like this. I can't think. Pass. Move on.
Pass. All right. As a kid, did you ever do something wrong and manage to pin it on a sibling?
Oh no, because my siblings were too much older than me. I pinned lots of bad things I did on my nephews, probably.
And what is the one thing that you would say is the meaning of life?
Love.
Love. And that's it. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you. We'll see you in a bit. Thank you, Shauna.
Bye.